Bluegrass Airport is an American aviation story. Its remarkable history has been chronicled through a series of oral history interviews. We're speaking with Jack Baugh, who was a fighter pilot in the United States Air Force, the former owner of Sprite flight jets, a fixed-base operator at Bluegrass Airport. He also created the Arlington Aircraft Company, builder of the world record-setting Sisu sailplane, now in the permanent collection of the National Air and Space Museum. Jack, would you talk about when you first became excited about aviation?
Well, my mother said it was when I was about 3 years old. She saved a little balsa wood model that I built sometime between 3 and 4, she wasn't sure, maybe 5 years of age. My dad and mom used to, on Sunday afternoons, we'd go to the airport and watch all the aircraft in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I just always had a love for aviation, and really, I wanted to make that a vocation. I was unable to determine how in the world I would ever make a living doing it, but I built model airplanes and learned to fly when I was about 12. And as soon as I was old enough to get licenses, I got them all. My dad was a pilot. We had 2 airplanes, and then we went and bought a couple of surplus airplanes after World War II, and we did a lot of aerobatics and cross-country work in those 2 aircraft. One was a stagger wing Beechcraft, and the other was a AT-6, now called the T-6. And I followed that. I went on to engineering school at North Carolina State University. For 2 years, transferred to Duke and graduated from Duke University in 1954. I was active in the Air Force ROTC, went into the Air Force, and flew there. When I worked at Duke, I worked with Dr. Norman Gutman in experimental psychology, and got my degree in engineering and psychology. And when I got my AFSC, the Air Force Specialty Code, my primary was psychological warfare officers. After pilot training, that primary changed to fighter pilot jet with a secondary Air Force Specialty Code of psychological warfare officer. When I got out, finished the Air Force duty, and went into private business. I was in the textile manufacturing business in North Carolina. Still flying, still enjoying that. And I got involved in gliding, soaring. I enjoyed that very much. As a matter of fact, I taught my children to fly gliders first, because that's a good primary way to learn all the basics. When you know that you've got the only power of the rising air or wave lift or thermal lift, you're pretty particular about where you're going and how you get there and how you're going to get back down safely. So that's how they started flying, and I'm still active with that. A company I created, Arlington Aircraft Company, also built the Sisu sailplane. My friend Al Parker broke the world record with that, and I traded him out of that one and gave it to the National Air and Space Museum in Washington. It's there on display. And then the sailplane, the Sisu that I flew, I gave to the National Soaring Museum in Elmira, New York, and it's now on display here in the Aviation Museum of Kentucky. So obviously I've always had a great interest in aviation. I bought Almahurst Farm in 1963 and moved permanently here in 1971. We did buy Sprite flight jets in 1986 and created the fixed base operation, the buildings which now house the Aviation Museum of Kentucky.
Tell us about learning to fly a glider when you were just a boy.
Actually, we built a primary glider. I think I showed a picture of that to you. It just has a stick fuselage. We had quite a neighborhood growing up, all young boys, all interested in aviation. Of course, World War II came along, and we followed everything there daily. And we built a primary glider. And we had after World War II, right after that, we had a gentleman who was an engineer and had been a fighter pilot, and we built this primary glider, and we were, Dr. Billy Graham's father had the farm right next to us in Charlotte, and we gotten permission from him to try to fly this glider in his cow pasture. And we were back there, had it all hooked up to bungee cords, ready to catapult it down the hill, when a fellow named Fay Daugherty, it's P-H-A-Y, Fay. He'd been a fighter pilot in World War II, and he happened to come along and say, "Whoa, wait a minute, guys, wait a minute, let's look this thing over." So we did, and he said, "Well, it looks pretty sound," and so do you mind if I fly? We said, "Oh, it'd be great." So we shot him off the hill, and it flew well, and he came back, he said, "Now, tell you what, if you guys will leave this alone, I'll take any of you up in my airplane." He was not only an engineer in Charlotte, but he also did air shows. He had a great biplane with a big engine in it, and he said, "If you'll not do this, you get permission, bring a letter from your families, I'll take you flying and teach anyone who wants to learn." That's how I learned to fly at age 12. And I couldn't get a license, of course, at that early age, but later did.
How many years have you been associated with Bluegrass Airport?
Well, my dad was in the standardbred, the harness racing as a hobby. He trained his horses in Pinehurst, which was about 90 miles from Charlotte, where we lived. And he was a pilot, and we would fly up here to the horse sales. And of course, this is, the Bluegrass is the center of it all as far as we're concerned. And that brought us in here in 1946 and 7, and ever since then. The administration building was just a small concrete block building. And it, of course, has grown. Then the fixed base operators, as I remember, we had an SO back then and a Gulf. I think it was Bluegrass Aeromotive and Baugh Aviation. And we would vary where we'd have our airplane tied down when we came up here, either one of the two. And gosh, I got to know Mr. Baugh. He was a wonderful, wonderful gentleman. And we were all interested in aircraft, and he was. And later on, when I had my own business, and I used to fly in and out of here, I had a 310 Cessna, and then I had an Aero Commander, and I traded that Aero Commander to Emhart Manufacturing for their DC-3 and sent it out to Remit Werner and got it jazzed up to an executive thing, and I used to fly it in and out of here. And so I've been associated with Bluegrass Airport since about 1946 and active in it since I think I said before, we bought Sprite flight jets and made it into a charter service and a fixed base operation.
Jack, do you have a favorite story related to Bluegrass Field?
Well, I had the great pleasure of having friends of George Gumbert and Wendell Murphy. And I guess Wendell Murphy's story is the funniest one, and it could have been a tragedy, but it was very lucky. They had a windstorm come through here, and Wendell had taxied the Piper Cub over to tie it down. The wind came along, and he was trying to hold it down, and the wind picked him up with the Piper Cub and lifted him way up in the air, and finally he got back down. But I think that's probably the story that sticks in my mind more about Bluegrass Airport in a humorous way.
What aviation achievement are you most proud of?
I think number one would be, although I had a lot of time flying before I went into the Air Force, I think getting the awards there and also winning my wings and flying as a jet fighter pilot in the United States Air Force certainly is there. And then in gliding, there are a number of achievements that one can try to get in soaring, and the Gold C with diamonds is the epitome of those, and I have that Gold C once at number 177, and also the diamonds for distance to a predetermined goal and high altitude. I mentioned about the Sisu sailplane company. We built 10 of those. They were mostly built by hand, designed by Leonard Nemi, and built mostly by Leonard Nemi and me. That was a hands-on operation. World records were set with that aircraft, and I think probably the fact that one's in the National Air and Space Museum and one's in Elmira and one's right here in this Aviation Museum of Kentucky pretty well takes care of those. In the 1960s, after I'd gotten out of served my time and enjoyed very much flying in the Air Force, I was interested in gliding and soaring. And we created the Arlington Aircraft Corporation. That was it was in Arlington, Texas, so we just used that name. Leonard Nemi had designed the sailplane, which was just outstanding. It was all metal. At that time, it had a glide ratio of 40-to-1. That is, it could go 40 miles if it were a mile high. That's sort of the way the L/D is determined, lift over drag. And so we had a little company over in Greenville, South Carolina at Donaldson Air Force Base. It had been Donaldson, and now at that time had become an industrial development. So we had our little company there, and we were doing low-speed aerodynamic studies, and we needed an engineer, and we needed someone who could spend full time at this. And a fellow named Dick Johnson, who was a soaring champion in Texas, whom I knew, suggested, after a lot of conversation, that I go find Leonard Nemi down in Arlington, Texas, which I did, and we formed this company and took this aircraft that he had built a prototype, and we built 10 of those, and it was called a Sisu, S-I-S-U. That's a Finn. He was a Finn. It's a Finnish word for strength and integrity. And this aircraft was just beyond its years, beyond its time and performance, and it was tough. It was a really tough aircraft. We built those 10 production models, and a friend of mine named Al Parker from Texas broke all the world records for distance on that, and I traded Al out of his world record plane and gave him mine at that time, and we then donated that aircraft to the National Air and Space Museum, where it now resides. The one that I then built for myself and flew quite a bit, I was trying to break an altitude record of 48,000 feet. But the problem I had was I was flying it out of Colorado over Pikes Peak, and we just didn't have I only got to 42,800 there. We pretty much had to go to the Sierras to really do that. And at that time, my textile business was rolling pretty well, and I just didn't have time to take that sailplane and go to California and try to do that. But that particular aircraft I gave to the National Soaring Museum in Elmira, New York. They in turn have lent it to us, and it's in the Air and Space Museum right here, the Kentucky Aviation Museum. So of the 10 of those Sisus that we built, 2 were crashed, and the others are in museums, and I think there are only 4 left that are still flying.
Tell us about dignitaries or interesting people you've met through Bluegrass Airport.
It's funny you bring that up. I remember one time when a group was putting together a national corporation, and they came into Sprite flight and with their jet, and they were having some trouble with it. As a matter of fact, it broke. It was a Gulfstream, and it broke down. And we flew those fellows to Gulfstream to get parts back and forth. I'm sorry, I just simply can't remember what corporation these guys were putting together, but Sprint, I know that the one had a lead in creating Sprint. That was it. And so we were helpful to them at Sprite Flight Jets at that point. We took care of the Treasury Department's jets that came in here bringing prisoners and taking prisoners back out of here, going wherever they went with them. We enjoyed those pilots, and they liked us. We had a huge American flag in the hangar over at Sprite Flight Jets, and Well, of course, you know, we're a pretty patriotic bunch here, and I think that the Treasury Department coming in and out was a neat thing, and we enjoyed talking to all those pilots. We had one of the major oil companies as a client, and talking to those fellows and their experiences was neat. We had 2 Learjets and a King Air and a Baron, and we enjoyed flying those, and it's just a real camaraderie with pilots, no matter what, whether military or not. And the first year we opened Sprite Flight Jets, we had Armed Forces Day here, and we were very fortunate to have the Marines came with a Harrier, and they put on a great display with a Harrier jet. We had a young man in here in an F-16, and I was talking to him with the F-16 about it. It was always an interesting airplane to me, and he said, well, you ought to see the F-18. He said, I'm in the Air Force Reserve, and I also fly the 18 because I work for NASA out of Jacksonville, but I was flying the 16 this weekend and able to bring it here to you all. So we talked about the 18 and the 16, and it's just an interesting thing with airmen. You know, today, especially in the airline business, I think you have drivers, aircraft drivers, and I think you have airmen. They're having this crash of the French jet, which left South America and was going to Paris and went through a weather problem there and went in. And then the other aircraft up in Albany, New York, that failed. Both those crashes came from the same reason: the wrong input to the controls. And I don't know how in the world that happened. We learned that in Piper Cubs, for crying out loud. So there's something in the training. I know the Air Force does a better job than any Air Force pilot would know better than to do what those 2 pilots did. It just blew my mind when I read those reports. I digress, I'm sorry. I do that when I talk about aviation. But George Gumbert and Wendell Murphy, both, George now and Wendell then and Doc then also, they're just treasures of information about this airport and flying and all. And it's a real pleasure to have known Wendell and to know George and to sit down and have the bull sessions that we have at the museum on a regular basis. We meet quarterly there and try to have people come in for presentations of aviation, civil and military. And we've been very fortunate to have the Navy and the Air Force and the Marines here on a regular basis.
How have changes in the aviation industry forced the airport to change?
The greatest hindrance and the greatest problem in the airline industry has been deregulation. That was supposed to be the great boon for everyone, for people who bought tickets for the airlines, and it's been a horrible mess. The competition has been such that airlines were actually ruined. Pan American's gone. American has filed bankruptcy. Yeah, we had really a very well regulated business. Now, I'm all for individual freedom most every time. But you know, the airline transportation of any sort really is a quasi-public situation. And they wrecked the airline industry when it was destabilized. I think that's had such a horrible effect on everything. Of course, 9/11 put us in the position of having the TSA, and it's going through growing pains. I think that probably the TSA should be a private industry and not a government regulation. You pick up the paper every day and see the individual freedoms, if I might say that seem to me to be defeated with the procedures. We can have security without having the mess that's going on now with the TSA. It has made it's a big impact with Bluegrass Field, with every other airport in the world.
Talk a little more about deregulation.
With deregulation, we saw a lot of things happen that probably also might be worth mentioning. I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, and Eastern Airlines was our major airline at that time. As a matter of fact, they gave us $11 million to build a whole new administration building, and then with that we got new runways, and it really grew. Well, Eastern's gone. But I think what happened also with the jet phase, jet aircraft is designed such, and with the engines, with the way the thrust works as opposed to a propeller-driven aircraft, it takes usually a longer runway. Now, that's been changed by a great deal with different designs for engines. But what happened was, when the long-range jets couldn't come in, say here, at Bluegrass, so we got a lot of regional airlines. And then the problem with that is that, like, Piedmont was a regional for me out of Charlotte, and out of Winston-Salem, and a lot of other regional, Mohawk and all, and the next thing you know, those, as these engineering things changed and the jet engine immediate thrust was changed so that you could have more immediate response for acceleration or deceleration, that influenced the length of runways required. And I think now, for example, the Emirates come in here with a 747 SP, which is a long-range version. They don't have any trouble getting in or out of here. That's not to say those pilots aren't great. Well, they are, because that takes a lot of skill to do what they do coming in and out of here with that aircraft. Still, the design of that engine has made a huge difference as to airport needs for jet aircraft. So while the regionals had a great rise, because the need of the smaller airports to submit them take care of them where the jets couldn't go, that's changed because the big ones can now come into most of those. You've seen Virgin Airway come in. It came in as a smaller, now it's a larger airline. That's sort of the growth of these things. There are other regionals that have been phased out, haven't made it. So it's a really an industry in constant change, and I don't see how that can ever change with deregulation. I'm usually opposed to regulation if you can get by without it, but on the quasi-public things such as transportation, just about have to have it. So that's back to that again. I think it's been a major change in all airports.
Tell us about Wendell Murphy.
He was a private pilot. He had been in the Air Force. He was an airman in the Air Force and loved flying and was a private pilot. But he had a congenital problem. He knew he was going to eventually be blind. His family had this, and he was. And Betty knew it, and she married him anyway, and what a gal she is. You might want to talk to Betty. She knows a lot about this airport.
Tell us about dignitaries or interesting people you've met through Bluegrass Airport.
I suppose some of the most interesting people who had a lot to do with this airport, one comes to mind, Mr. Garvis Kincaid. He was a real character. He put together a whole group of banks and created the Central Bank. And he loved aviation and he did so much for this airport. Matter of fact, he's on the plaque downstairs. He was chairman of the airport board when this whole thing was put together and built into what it is today. I got to know him early on when I first, I bought Almahurst Farm in 1963, and I was on the board. I was treasurer of the Red Mile. Actually, the Lexington Trots Breeders Association, which owned the Red Mile and the racetrack and all. And he was on that board, and we had more fun back and forth. And when he built his new building, he knew I was in the textile business and had a lot to do with Fieldcrest Mills. And the company to which I did sell my textile business eventually. So when he built that, he was telling me about the carpet and how much his carpet was going to cost. And I said, what? That can't be cost that much. I said, wait a minute. So I got some people from Fieldcrest to come up here. And I think he had his whole building carpeted with Fieldcrest for about 30% of what the bids were before. So we were close buddies from then on. And another funny thing with Garvis, he just loved this airport. And he was a hands-on man for almost forever. And he got George Gumbert to come on and be the chairman of it. But one time my son and I were bone fishing down in the Florida Keys, and we're going to stay a little longer than we had anticipated. And I thought, well, you know, Philip, I need to go here to the bank. I saw a bank down here in Duck Key or somewhere in here that had a Bank AmeriCard sign on it. That's how long ago it was. And I went in and told people what I wanted, and she had the manager come out and say, well, where are you from? And I told him Lexington and all that sort of thing. And he said, well, you've got the Bank AmeriCard, and so we lend money on that, of course, but do you mind if I call somebody up in Lexington? I said, oh, that'll be fine. And he came back laughing, and I said, well, is something wrong? He said, no, I'd happened to talk to Mr. Garvis Kincaid, who owns this bank, and he said to give you the whole bank if you wanted it. So that's the kind of person Garvis Kincaid was, and he treated everybody just as if they were his own family. And he did the job here that needed to be done at the time it was done. When we had the Sprite Flight Jets as a fixed base operation here, we met a lot of wonderful people who came in and out of here. Sprite Flight Jets was a fixed base operation here, and I might mention to you how Sprite Flight got the name. I had an Aero Commander, and I was living here, and I was in the standardbred business, harness racing. And the Hambletonian, which is the premier race, it's like the Kentucky Derby, but of the harness racing, was held at that time in DuQuoin, Illinois. Well, Bill Terry, another real character, who built a great company at Coca-Cola, with Coca-Cola as a distributor. Bill just wouldn't fly. He drove everywhere. And I told him I was going out to DuQuoin. He said, well, you know, I recently bought that bottling company, and that took care of all the Coca-Cola bottles from DuQuoin, Illinois to New Orleans. So he said, I'll be out there. Matter of fact, he said, I want you to stay in my suite at the Coca-Cola plant. Well, we did that. But I flew down there, and he finally showed up, and I said, well, Bill, how long did it take you to get out here? He said, oh, I think 6 or 7 hours. How long did it take you? I said, 45 minutes. He said, you're kidding me. Well, as luck would have it, the second day there, he had an emergency back here, and he came and he said, could you possibly fly me back to Lexington? I said, yep. So I said, not only that, I'll wait for you and bring you back. So we did that, and we flew back, and he said, you know what, I'm going to buy an airplane. Well, Bill Terry was Bill Terry, and not only did he buy an airplane, he bought a Learjet and got a crew and created the company, the charter company called Sprite Flight Jets. Well, Coca-Cola and Sprite, that's how he got the name of Sprite Flight Jets. And he brought in a partner, George Evans, who was another wonderful fellow, a great industrialist, who sold his whole coal interest, most of them, to General Electric. And those two were a real pair. And eventually, I bought Sprite Flight Jets, the charter company, from Bill Terry and George Evans. And George Gumbert was chairman of this airport board, and we talked about having another fixed base operation here. That is, an operation that maintained aircraft, that chartered aircraft, that had its own charter service, provided fuel and everything needed for the visitor to Bluegrass Field. I said, well, George, I think maybe we can do that. And we got together with a group, and we formed the fixed base operation, but kept the name Sprite Flight Jets. And we built the facility over on this airport, which now houses the Aviation Museum of Kentucky. I built that in 1986, bought it, Sprite Flight, the charter service in '86, and built that facility. And then later sold it to Page Avjet, who sold it to Josephine Abercrombie, who sold it to TAC Air. And TAC Air is a great fixed base operator here. They just do wonderful work. They built a new terminal, which left the building that I had built for Sprite Flight jets empty, and I had been chairman of the Aviation Museum of Kentucky. And George Gumbert has been the president. Well, George and Wendell Murphy were the founders of the Aviation Museum of Kentucky. So since then, Ray Garman has become chairman of the Aviation Museum of Kentucky and done a great job. And recently, the Aviation Museum of Kentucky moved to those facilities which were built as Sprite Flight jets. So come see us at the Aviation Museum of Kentucky. We'd love to have you.
Jack, do you have any stories about interesting people coming through Bluegrass Field?
In the past, at Bluegrass Field, many celebrities have come here. And recently, I think it was sort of interesting. I was over at the old Sprite Flight facilities, which are now the new Aviation Museum of Kentucky, and we recently moved in there. So I was there, and I noticed a fellow kept walking around looking at everything, kept looking at me, and I walked over and said, "Is there something I can help you with?" He said, "Well, I am from a security service, and Mitt Romney is going to be here tonight, and he's going to be over at the new TAC Air facilities, but they're going to divide your two hangars to one group who've given so much money to Mitt Romney and the other group who've given more money to Mitt Romney, and we're trying to decide how to move them back and forth." I said, "Well, that's easy. There are two big doors over there, and you'll provide the security." He said, "Well, how are we going to get them from over at TAC Air?" I said, "You'll have to deal with TAC Air and the airport security on that one. All I can do is tell you what you can do in here, and we'll be glad to have you." Prior to that, gosh, I about every movie person you could think of, from Elizabeth Taylor on over, has been here at one time or another. We, back before Sprite Flight even was created, we had really great fixed base operators here. Baugh Aviation and Bluegrass Aviation were here, and others, and they all did a great job and made people comfortable to come in here. In private planes or commercial airliners. I know the gentleman who was responsible for the success of the Indianapolis 500 was in and out of here forever.
How old were you when you first started flying into Lexington?
I was 14. And 1946 was, I think, probably my first time here with my dad, who was in the standardbred business. I think I mentioned we trained our horses in Pinehurst, but we raced here at the Red Mile every year, and came here for the horse sales where my dad bought yearlings, and later I did that. But we were in and out of here from 1946 right on up until, well, here I am. Originally from Charlotte, North Carolina. Lived the first 40 years of my life there, and I've lived the second 40 years of my life here. So I've been associated in one way or another with the Bluegrass Airport since 1946.
Jack, any other thoughts you'd like to share?
What happened on the jet aircraft that I flew in the Air Force, when you came forward on the throttle, it took a while for that thrust to build up and take effect. And so you can imagine you had to stay ahead of it all the time so you didn't get to a dangerous thing. Well, that also has changed now to the point where you get almost immediate thrust, and that has allowed these shorter runways to be able to be used by a larger and heavier and faster aircraft. That has really changed a great deal, so that now the airport operator here, and we've got a good one now here, we've had good ones, and I think our new director is really has done a great job in getting more flights in and out of here that are, if you get the flights and they don't carry the load and they don't get the revenue, they don't last long. But he's done a good job. And I think those aircraft that are now able to do this, and this is out of my expertise, but I do know that has a lot to do with.
Talk about your years in the Air Force.
I graduated from Duke University in 1954, and because of the Air Force ROTC, I became an officer, a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force Reserve. I went to pilot training, and I flew. My primary training was in Marianna, Florida. We flew PA-18s, which was a modified Piper Cub, and T-6, the North American T-6. I wanted to go to B-47s at that point, but when I went into the Air Force, I already had about 1,200 hours flying time. So I had a squadron commander named James Purvis, who was flying F-102s out of Tyndall Air Force Base in Panama City. And Colonel Purvis knew that I had time, and he flew with me a number of times on check rides, and he would take me down to fly in the T-33 with him in the back seat. So before I went to basic, I was familiar with the T-33 and enjoyed it and liked it, but I still wanted to fly multi-engine aircraft. I just wanted to go to SAC, the Strategic Air Command, but Purvis said, "You're not going there, you're going to fighters," and I did. So I went to Webb Air Force Base and at Big Spring, Texas, and graduated, got my wings there, and I think you mentioned before that I had an Air Force Specialty Code of Psychological Warfare Officer, secondary. Primary was fighter pilot jet. And so I flew F-86s, enjoyed that very much, and until I went to Chanute Air Force Base on Air Force Maintenance Officer School, and there they only had C-45s, which was a twin Beech. Well, a reciprocating engine. Well, I had time in a twin Beech, so I got to fly those, and that was fun. But then later on, when I left the Air Force, I did fly other aircraft in other parts of the world. Enjoyed every minute of all of it, and I'm trying to put together a book, which one of these days, really putting together for my children, for nothing else. Well, I've flown a lot of different aircraft, and I've really enjoyed every one of them. I love to fly gliders. I love to fly Piper Cubs, and I enjoyed very much jet fighters. I guess my favorite airplane of all is a stagger wing Beech. Now that's a Beech D-17. It was one of the first 200-mile-an-hour private aircraft. It's called a stagger wing because it was a biplane, and the wings were staggered. The low wing was forward of the top wing. It had a big radial 450 horsepower engine in it. As a matter of fact, I got my instrument rating in that Beech. I'm not sure that I really deserved to get that rating, but I think the CAA at that time, the Civil Aeronautics Association, that was before the FAA, I think he was more enamored with that airplane, so I let him fly it, and I believe he passed me for my instrument ticket when I was 18 years old, mainly because of that. It was a wonderful airplane. My father had some health problems, and when I was in the Air Force, he sold that airplane and the T-6 that we had flown. The stagger wing Beech was my all-time favorite, I think. But once you fly a jet fighter, there's not much near it except the Learjet. The Learjet flew like a fighter. It was a wonderful airplane, and we had 2 of those in our charter service here at Sprite Flight Jets.
Any advice for young people interested in flying?
One thing I would like to mention at this point, it's maybe a little commercial for the Aviation Museum of Kentucky, But our mission is to present to the community, to the entire state, and to the country a history of aviation. It's also to teach young people of all the various occupations available in the sport, industry, and really fun of aviation. We work with the Kentucky educational system. We have we have good docents and volunteers who work hard at the museum every day but Monday. And we have buses coming from schools all over the state, from the west, far west, from the far east, central Kentucky. We put on shows for them. We have tours for them. And we really delight in having young people come to understand the great opportunities in aviation. One thing that comes to mind, it's very interesting. You would think that only the boys who come here are interested in aviation. But I can tell you that we have plenty of young women. We have a number of young women who come here. We had a tour one Saturday, and we had a young woman who, I think she was 15 at that time, and she just asked all the right questions, and just, you could tell that she just loved this aviation, this sport of aviation. And her mother called, and she wanted to talk to the fellow who was the docent that day. It was I. And she said, I want you to know my daughter is a wonderful daughter. She's never been in any trouble at all. She's a good student, but she just has not known up until now what she wanted to do. She came home and said, Mom, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going into aviation. I'm going into engineering. She went to engineering. She got her PhD, and she was one of the lead engineers on the planning and production of the F-22. So we are doing our job at the Aviation Museum of Kentucky. And really, I'd say that we have maybe 30% of those who really ask the right questions are girls, young women. And when that happens, we know we've done our job with that tour. If I could have figured out a way to make a living doing this, that's all I would have done. But you know, when I first graduated from pilot training, I was in Pinehurst, North Carolina, with my dad, where we trained our horses. And I met a man there who had an airline like Flying Tiger. He'd been in Flying Tiger Airline, but he did a lot of work for the CIA. And he said, what are you doing now? And I said, well, I'm in the textile business, but I really miss aviation. He said, I'll give you a job. And I said, well, what is that? He said, well, I'll get you checked out in a 707, and you'll be flying that. And I said, well, that's interesting. And my dad said, what's the money? And he said, well, we start off at $12,000. Well, I had 3 children at this point. So that was the end of that story. And my dad said, you better stick to the cotton business, boy, which I did.
What is it like to be a fighter pilot?
Well, you know, really, it's just not the old wearing the scarf in the wind sort of thing anymore. It's all by the numbers. That's not to say that it's not exhilarating. It is exhilarating. It's an exhilaration, there's no question about that. But it really is all by the numbers. And it's a highly technical, you get out of bound of the numbers, you die. So that's the way it is.
Can you comment on airports and their importance to the community?
Airports are an interesting thing. They are a tremendous asset to a community. I grew up, the first 40 years of my life I spent in Charlotte, North Carolina. We had a small airport there, and Charlotte was about 200,000 people at that point. And this was taken over by the government in World War II, became Morris Field. Later was changed to Douglas International Airport, Mayor Douglas, who had been mayor in Charlotte after World War II. It has grown into a major hub. U.S. Air is there. It was a major hub for Eastern Airlines before their demise. And I think the same thing that happened in Charlotte happened here in Lexington at Bluegrass Field. It was taken over by the Army Air Corps, and it grew to be a much larger airport. Airports are a magnificent magnet for industry. Because of the airport in Charlotte, we got Westinghouse and General Electric and a number of other big board companies. And gosh, all you got to do here in Lexington is drive around New Circle Road and you can see what I think the airport did for this community. You've got Lilly, Cup, and General Electric, and oh my, I can't think of all, but we've got, count them, you have to have both hands to count what this airport's done for this community. Charlotte grew from about 250,000 when I was a boy to the city-county merger like we have here in Fayette now. The city-county is over 1 million in Charlotte, and look what's happened here. The same thing with the Lexington-Fayette urban county government. Been fantastic. And I think the airport has had a major, major influence on the growth of Fayette County. One thing that's interesting about Fayette County that might not have been mentioned, you know, Raleigh, North Carolina, I'm really familiar with that, has grown because it's a capital city. Capital cities grow. Fayette County, Lexington, Kentucky, is really the capital city of Kentucky. People who live in Frankfort may not like that, but this was the bedroom community for Frankfort. It now has all blended together, and it's been a magnificent magnet for people because it really is the major part of the capital city of the state of Great Commonwealth of Kentucky. And Bluegrass Airport is one of the major reasons for that growth. Certainly it goes without saying that I doubt seriously that IBM would ever have come here without the Bluegrass Airport. And look what it did, look what Fayette County did for IBM and IBM did for Fayette County. It was a wonderful, great thing.